Hello everybody, welcome to the channel. If you want to keep watching these awesome videos, then like this video and subscribe and follow and comment. Link in the below. Thanks for watching. Oh my gosh, I'll stop it.
Judge, we are on the record as State versus Danielle Dauphinais. We are here this morning for a sentencing hearing after Ms. Dauphinais was completely referred to on September 26, 2024. I'm just going to ask all counsel to identify yourself for the record before we begin, starting with counsel for the state, please.
Your Honor, Bethany Durant for the state. Good morning, Megan Hageman for the state.
Good morning, Your Honor. Benjamin Faulkner for Danielle Dauphinais, who's here in the courtroom.
Good morning, Your Honor. David Jewish for Danielle Dauphinais.
Good morning. You may proceed.
Thank you.
This is the sentencing in State versus Danielle Dauphinais, 2/26/2021, CR 944. Before we start, I'll just advise counsel again, as I did in our meeting before the hearing, about what I have reviewed in preparation for this particular sentencing. I've been involved in this case since the bail hearing that occurred on October 20th of 2021. I've reviewed all of the pleadings from that date through today that have been filed. Specifically, in terms of the sentencing hearing, I have reviewed the audio of the September 26, 2024 plea hearing. I've reviewed all of the exhibits that were submitted at that hearing, the notice of intent regarding the October 21, 2021 pro-offer, along with the motion in limine in response that was filed to that. I've reviewed the state's sentencing memorandum, and I have reviewed the defendant's sentencing memorandum. I've also reviewed the sentencing sheets. With that being said, we'll start with the state's presentation. I'll turn to you, Attorney Furman.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Your Honor, as this court is aware, just weeks before trial was about to start in this case, but 3 years after the murder of Elijah Lewis, the defendant entered into this guilty plea, which is a capped plea to second-degree murder knowing. The sentence on this charge is capped at 55 years to life. The charge does have a minimum possible sentence of 35 years to life because it involves the murder of a child under the age of 13. The defendant further pled guilty to 2 counts of tampering with witnesses, and the sentence as to those charges is fully negotiated. That sentence should be 3.5 to 7 years on each charge to run concurrently with one another, but consecutive to whatever sentence this court imposes on the murder charge. As such, with her guilty plea, the defendant faces a possible sentence of 58.5 years to life incarceration. With this guilty plea, the defendant is waiving her right to seek earned time credit under RSA 651A 22A. The defendant agrees that she is jointly liable for any restitution that we have capped at $40,000 pursuant to the statute. The defendant also agrees that she shall not profit in any way from the life or the death of Elijah Lewis. Specifically, she agrees that she shall not accept any payment, enter into any contract, or sell any rights regarding any book, film, television show, radio show, website, podcast, writing, recording, broadcast, or internet posting relating to the offenses, to the murder, or to Elijah Lewis. Your Honor, in turning our attention to sentencing, I have up on the screen State's Exhibit Number 1. All exhibits have been either admitted at the sentencing hearing or plea hearing or agreed to as full exhibits for sentencing. In turning our attention to sentencing, the state is going to ask this court to impose a sentence of 55 years to life on the charge of second-degree murder for the defendant's actions in the death of her 5-year-old son, Elijah Lewis. We note that the defendant will ask this court to impose no more than the mandatory minimum penalty of 35 years to life on this charge. But that minimum penalty cannot and should not ever apply in a case as egregious as this. There is nothing minimal about the lengths to which the defendant went in order to lie to the agency that was investigating Elijah's whereabouts in October of 2021. There's nothing minimal about the efforts that she took to try to get her sister, Tracy Dauphinais, to lie for her, or about the efforts she took in getting Bruce Rowland, also known as Bruce Scherzer, to lie for her. And there's nothing minimal about the lengths that she went to flee from this murder and to hide the evidence of her crime. Your Honor, because of the scheduling purposes that prevented the court, Your Honor, from being present, we just wanted to take a moment. We understand you have reviewed the sentencing here, the plea hearing, we wanted to take a moment to lay out the timeline of the events that happened when essentially the defendant's lies caught up with her. Those events occurred beginning October the 14th of 2021 and didn't end until October 23rd of 2021 when investigators located Elijah's body. Your Honor, on October the 14th at 8:07 in the morning, according to phone records, the defendant was on the phone with DCYF, who was asking her where Elijah was. At that point, her story was that Elijah had gone, that he had just left. The defendant's phone then showed that between 8:25 in the morning and 12:47 that afternoon, she contacted or had contact with her sister over 87 times. At 12:45 p.m., when the worker called Tracy Dauphinais in California to ask where Elijah was, Tracy Dauphinais had no choice but to admit that the defendant had told her to lie, and Tracy refused to lie, refusing to place Elijah as being present in the state of California. That led DCYF to reach back out to the defendant between 1:03 and 1:18 p.m. when they again confronted her about Elijah. On that occasion, the defendant, after pausing, after hesitating, indicated that Elijah had been relocated to Texas with Bruce Scherzer. The defendant's phone records showed that between 1:12 and 1:52 p.m., there were 7 calls between the defendant and Bruce Scherzer, which included the text message where the defendant said to Mr. Scherzer, "It was September 10th, Friday, when you came and got him. You drove up and got him." In a span of less than 4 hours, the defendant went from "he's gone, he left," to "he's in California," to "he went to Texas on September 10th, Friday." At 1:45 p.m. that day, DCYF was able to contact Bruce, who lied for the defendant and told DCYF that Elijah was living in Texas. Your Honor, it is important for the court to recognize that Bruce Scherzer, who lied to DCYF when the defendant asked him to, and for hours until 9:30 p.m. that evening, maintained that Elijah was with him in California, is the person from whom the defendant has submitted a character reference. Your Honor, the state would submit that given Mr. Scherzer's tendency to lie when being asked to do so by the defendant, the court should give his reference as to her character little or no weight. The evidence would suggest that Mr. Scherzer, at the time that he lied for the defendant and claimed to have Elijah, actually knew about the defendant's abuse of this child. Mr. Scherzer doesn't mention it in his character reference, but the court should also know that he and the defendant have been in communication since her incarceration, during which time they've become involved in a romantic relationship. He also doesn't mention in his character letter the communications that they had, showing his knowledge of the abuse. Between May 24th of 2021 and June 5th of 2021, Facebook records show that the defendant and Mr. Scherzer spoke. They exchanged messages. There was no earlier content recovered, and the only later communications were found to actually have occurred on October 14th, 2021, the day when the defendant got him to lie. At that point, Mr. Scherzer said, "Well, I thought it was just a wellness check." But Mr. Scherzer's knowledge is shown in the Facebook records. In those records, the defendant told Mr. Scherzer on May 24th that she wasn't able to love Elijah, no matter how hard she tried. On June 5th, 2021, the defendant complained to him over Facebook. She said Elijah frequently urinated, to which Mr. Scherzer told her to "fuck him up, babe, wrap him in a blanket and tie it so he can't get out, show him the 5-knuckle shuffle." The defendant responded that she had given him the 1-hand slam, the 5-finger banger. She fucked him up a little and the nigga just laughed. She went on to say that she threw his ass in a fucking cold shower and stuck him in front of a fan, and still nothing. The defendant later told Bruce that he, referring to Elijah, needs to be 6 feet under, out of my fucking life, done, kaput, later fucking gata. She said, "I hate this kid, I fucking hate him, not an ounce of love I have for him, not even a fucking smidge." And knowing all of that, in October of 2021, Bruce Scherzer still agreed to lie for the defendant. His reference should contain 0 weight for this court. Your Honor, at 3 p.m. on October the 14th, DCYF reported to the Merrimack Police Department that Elijah was missing. At 3:16 p.m., the defendant was on the phone with the Merrimack Police Department telling them that she would meet them at the police department by 4:30 that afternoon. And to remind the court of the next actions that occurred, at 3:20 that afternoon, the defendant and Mr. Staff withdraw money from Joanne Staff's account with Elijah's body in the back of their pickup truck. At 4:44 p.m., the defendant and Mr. Staff were at Target in Burlington, Massachusetts to buy their new phones and some new clothing and toiletries for their flight. Elijah's body in the back of the truck at the Target. Between 11:36 and 11:52 that evening, the defendant and Mr. Staff were in Abington, Massachusetts, where they were burying where Joseph Staff buried Elijah in a shallow hole. Your Honor, phone records in this case showed several things. The phone records with respect to October the 14th placed both the defendant and Mr. Staff at the burial site during their communications. Those communications being the defendant telling Mr. Staff at 11:48 p.m. that it doesn't have to be big, referring to the hole he was trying to dig. And at 12:04 that morning saying it doesn't have to be far down, you know. Phone records would also show their relationship with each other, who was in their home at certain times and who was not. Your Honor, when detectives responded to the burial site, State's Exhibit 18, inside of the red circle, while it's hard to see, shows the back of Elijah Lewis's body as he lays in the shallow hole that Joseph Staff dug and didn't dig too big or too deep at the defendant's direction. Your Honor, the defendant and Mr. Staff, once they buried and discarded Elijah's body at 7 o'clock on the 15th, arrived at the Mohegan Sun Casino. At 8:46 that morning, the morning of October 16th of 2021, Your Honor, the defendant's new phone showed that she was aware of what she was fleeing from. She took several moments to research the U.S. Marshal's Most Wanted list. U.S. Marshal's Most Wanted Google search off of the defendant's phone. U.S. Marshal's warrant list off of the defendant's phone. How do you find out if someone is wanted by the U.S. Marshals? Searches off of the defendant's phone. Within hours, the defendant and Mr. Staff boarded a bus and left for New York City. On October the 17th at 7 o'clock in the morning, about 7:13, the defendant and Mr. Staff were arrested in the subway in the Bronx, New York. A review of the body-worn camera from that arrest shows that upon being arrested, the defendant told officers that Mr. Staff's name was Dylan Sanford. Your Honor, at 11:16 that evening, the defendant waived Miranda rights and she spoke with investigators. And there are several statements inside of that lie that she told, because the first statement the defendant made was that Elijah had walked away from the home at some point in September and that they just hadn't found him, hadn't reported him missing. In her post-arrest statement, she first stated, Detective Catherine Shackford asked, well, how can we find Elijah? And the defendant said, look everywhere. If I knew, I would have found him. Did you guys search the lake? I don't know. I didn't search the lake. I don't know if he could be in there, or if someone took him, or if he went on the main road, or I don't know. I want to find him. That's all we wanted. That's all we wanted was to find him so everything would be okay. That's all we wanted. Later in the interview, Detective Matthew Amatucci asked, has he bled in that bathroom? The defendant's response, so he would shower and slip. And there was this one time where he slipped down and he nicked his eye right there and had a little cut. Later in her statement, she talked about the note that was found in their truck saying, we're going to come back. We wanted to go down to New York. The defendant, hours and days before, had just buried her 5-year-old child. The defendant made additional statements, Your Honor, with respect to this case. In fact, in that same statement, the defendant told investigators, no one hurt that little boy. No one fucking hurt that little boy. We are not monsters. We're very good people. We're very nice. Our kids are well taken care of. Do not judge us because we're drug addicts. We would not hurt our kids. I'll take that to my fucking grave. Further on in the statement, you guys are assuming that we hurt our son and buried him. Later on, we didn't do anything. We did not. There's no body. Your Honor, when the defendant was transported back to New Hampshire, she was appointed an attorney. She agreed to speak with investigators alongside that attorney. Her only requirement during that hearing was to tell the truth. When asked about the condition that Elijah was in when she last saw him, which she described as the night before his death, the defendant, upon being asked, when was the last time you saw him, the night before? She says, yes. The interviewer said, what was his physical condition then? She says, perfectly fine. The interviewer says, okay, any injuries to his body? She says, no. The interviewer says, any injuries to his back? She says, no. The interviewer, any bruises? There was no audible reply. The interviewer said, okay, so no issues with his body whatsoever. And the defendant said, well, he had a cut on his head because he bangs his head constantly, so he had a little cut on his head. The interviewer said, where did he get that from? And she said, the tile. He bashed his head on the tile. The interviewer said, in the bathroom? And she said, in the bathroom. And so the only injury that the defendant reported to investigators on the day when she had agreed that she would tell the truth was a little cut on his head. Your Honor, 2 days later, by tracking those cellular phones of the defendants, by speaking with Joseph's staff, who described the location where Elijah had been buried, investigators from the New Hampshire State Police, using cadaver dogs, recovered Elijah's body from that shallow grave. The medical examiner determined that Elijah died as a result of facial and scalp injuries. Multiple facial and scalp defects, 15, were found. Multiple lacerations and defects of his oral mucosa. Periorbital or eye swelling and ecchymosis surrounding the right eye. Acute fentanyl intoxication. Malnourishment, including a marked loss of skeletal muscle and of subcutaneous fat that was independent of the decomposition process. He had a body mass index of 10.3 and weighed only 19 pounds. The investigator also found that he had 3 pressure ulcers on his back, the largest of which was several inches, and penetrated not only his skin, but through to his bone. He also found that he had Wisniewski spots of his gastric mucosa, which are evident of hypothermia. Your Honor, the defendant in her sentencing memorandum now argues that Elijah didn't die as a result of physical injuries. And defense counsel in that memorandum cites to the defendant's retained forensic pathologist and quotes her as saying that an examination of the skull, the brain, and its coverings revealed no injury. But had Dr. Richard Atkinson, who conducted the autopsy, testified, and is clear in his report, he would have testified at trial that due to the advanced state of decomposition of Elijah's body, from being deceased since September of 2021, left in trash bags in a plastic tote bin outside of the defendant's home, and then from being buried outside for a week, Elijah's brain and even his spinal cord are described as liquefied. Dr. Atkinson would have testified, as he indicated in his report, that there was no way to include or to exclude a brain injury because a full examination is not possible when there's no brain to examine. Dr. Lapisada would have added, though, and testified that she determined that Elijah's death was due to another cause, due to physical and medical neglect by his caretakers with what she describes as a history of having been confined. She indicated that medical conditions such as a lack of growth or weight loss would have been issues that a caretaker would notice, a guardian would notice. Your Honor, his mother would have noticed, and it would have required her to take action and take a trip to a doctor's office. Physical neglect, as described by Dr. Lapisada, included malnourishment, his extreme weight loss, his confinement, his exposure to cold environment, and the ulcers on his back, which were caused by laying on a hard surface for a period of time. Your Honor, there is nothing minimal in the victim blaming and blame shifting that is demonstrated in the defense's sentencing memorandum. Elijah Lewis was a 5-year-old child. He was completely dependent on the adults around him to ensure his safety and his well-being. He was completely dependent on his mother, who was his primary caretaker for the year leading up to his death. The defendant, not Tim Lewis, tortured this little boy. The defendant, not Tim Lewis, failed to obtain medical treatment for him. It was the defendant, in conjunction, yes, with actions by Joseph's staff, but her actions in failing to regard this child that caused his death. Elijah Lewis was 4 years old when the defendant sought him out. She reached out to his paternal grandparents. His father, Timothy Lewis, then contacted her. Defense counsel attached an email from Mr. Lewis to their sentencing memorandum. In that email, Mr. Lewis told the defendant that Elijah had some issues. He had problems. Tim Lewis asked her about autism. He asked her about fetal alcohol syndrome. He asked her about aggression and developmental delays. He told her about specialists he was working with and had been working with. And still the defendant wanted to be a part of her son's life. And still the defendant said she would love to see him, would love to have a relationship with him. After 30 days of that visit, she asked to extend it for more time. After that, she asked to keep him for the school year. She had conversations about some concerns that she had, about problems. She changed her mind back and forth about what she wanted to do in terms of Elijah Lewis. But the one thing that never changed, and I apologize, I'm losing my voice, Your Honor, I have a cold. The one thing that she never did, the one thing that never changed, is her failure to treat Elijah as a child, her failure to get him any help. You know, the defense points out that failure, it's not her fault. It's Tim Lewis, right? He failed to share his insurance payment information with the defendant, as though that precluded Elijah from getting medical care here in New Hampshire. Among many other options that existed to ensure that Elijah was being treated medically when needed, billing Tim Lewis, telling him where the appointment would be so he could do as he suggested and share the information directly with the doctor. Elijah was covered on medical services assistance through New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services beginning on June the 11th of 2020. Those are services the defendant applied for, and there's no indication she ever used them. It's clear from her text messages that they received routine care for JS, their daughter. On November 2nd of 2020, the defendant was at a doctor's appointment with JS. She told staff that JS was getting shots, which made the defendant feel mean, and she said she wished it was Elijah getting the shots instead. Your Honor, defense appears to blame Mr. Lewis for the failure of the defendant to send Elijah to California to be with her sister. They cite to emails saying that it wasn't until April 5th of 2021 that Tracy Dauphinais received the final paperwork from Tim Lewis, allowing guardianship to transfer to Tracy Dauphinais. On April 5th of 2021, Elijah Lewis was alive. He could walk. He could stand. He remained alive for 5 more months, during which time the defendant did nothing to transfer guardianship of this child, her child, to her sister. A blank guardianship form was found in the basement of 7 Sunset Drive when the apartment was searched. She did nothing to help Elijah. She continued to torture him. Assaults, isolation, starvation, and neglect. Your Honor, on April the 14th of 2021, 9 days after Tracy Dauphinais had Tim Lewis's completed paperwork giving her guardianship on that end, but nothing from the defendant made it clear to Joseph's staff that she had actually no intention of sending Elijah to California unless she could fix him. Your Honor, she said, and I apologize, I had to move my computer, but she said, I'm not going to change sentence so he can do this shit to my sister. It's not like he's going back to his dad's. He's going to my sister's house. He needs to fucking understand that this behavior is not okay. He's going to get bullied in school and my sister's going to lose her mind. She's trying to have a baby and I know he's going to cause a lot of stress. So the least I can do is get this fucker to stop. He needs to be watched 24/7. This kid isn't going to change because of eating, drinking, and sleeping. He's a fucked up individual. I apologize, I need some water. Your Honor, so that there is no misconception, the state has never argued or said that Elijah was without behavioral issues. But the behaviors of a 5-year-old child do not and did not give the defendant an allowance to beat him, isolate him, torture him, starve him, kill him, or participate in dumping his body in a shallow grave. His behaviors did not and do not minimize her adult actions, and they should not have an impact on the sentence she receives. Her actions were not minimal, and her sentence should reflect that. DCYF, Your Honor, was involved and became involved with the defendant in October of 2020, 10 months before Elijah's death, and as a result of concerns raised by his father, Tim Lewis. At that time, in October of 2020, Elijah weighed at least 32 pounds. He was alive, he could walk, and he could move. And even at that time, the defendant's messages to Joseph's staff and the DCYF records show that she knew she had to treat him better because DCYF was involved. We have to be careful about Elijah because of what's going on, so I gave him a bubble bath with toys. Your Honor, the defendant's messages to Mr. Staff reveal that her concern about DCYF involvement wasn't about the treatment Elijah was receiving, but rather her fear that once uncovered, she would lose her daughter. It had nothing to do about the behavior of the little boy that she now is blaming for his own death. Your Honor, December 22nd of 2020, 9 months before Elijah's death, the defendant told her DCYF worker that right after the holidays, she'd be going to California with Elijah. Her sister was going to pay for the plane tickets. The next day, December 23rd, 2020, the defendant reported to her DCYF worker that Elijah was doing great. She said he'd improved. She described him as sweet, doing what he was supposed to do, not peeing anywhere he wasn't supposed to, and she wasn't even sure that she wanted her sister to adopt Elijah anymore. As a result, the very next day, December the 24th of 2020, DCYF closed their open assessments. The defendant received a therapy referral to Greater Nashua Mental Health, a place her phone records show never got called. She said she was still going to move Elijah to California to be with her sister, but did nothing. But the case was closed. And her risk of losing her daughter was diminished. And so Elijah faded again into the background. Dr. Cindy Christian would have testified during trial that in her review of the records and evidence in this case, Elijah was a victim of child torture. We indicated what the definition of child torture was in the plea hearing, and it bears repeating today. Child torture refers to a child who endures an extended period of time, characterized by at least 2 physical assaults or 1 extended one, 2 or more forms of psychological maltreatment, and of neglect, which results in prolonged suffering, permanent disfigurement, or in this case, death. Dr. Christian reviewed the file. She reviewed all of the evidence in this case and not mere portions of it. She concluded that Elijah suffered from this type of torture, from repeated physical assaults, from ongoing psychological maltreatment, including emotional rejection, denigration, isolation, and denial of care, and of severe physical neglect, which resulted in death. She discussed Elijah's behaviors inside of that report, and she indicated that some of those behaviors could be developmental, but also that they may have been a response to his ongoing abuse and neglect, representing oppositional defiance to his treatment. It was Elijah fighting back the only way he knew how, by being defiant. She found that Elijah was forced to sleep in a bathtub as punishment for enuresis and encopresis, urinating and defecating. He was denied medical care for his injuries and his malnutrition. He was denied necessities of life, including food, drink, and safe sleeping. And as the court heard in the messages where the defendant was refusing to send Elijah to California to ruin her sister, she didn't think he'd get better from food or drink or sleeping. Over the course of time that the defendant had Elijah inside of her home, there were people available to help her. There were people who offered to help her. The defendant never reached out to Elijah's paternal grandparents, people she knew how to contact and knew were close enough to visit or to help. In one message to Tim Lewis, she indicates that his parents could come visit. The defendant never reached out to Elijah's paternal aunts, at least one of whom she had once called family. She never asked her brothers or their wives or her friends for help. In fact, a friend of the defendant's with an autistic child offered help, and the defendant never took her up on it. Joanne's staff offered to make calls with the defendant to seek services. The defendant had Joseph message Joanne's staff and tell her to keep out of it. Your Honor, on April 20th of 2021, 5 months before Elijah's death, the defendant messaged Joseph's staff and said, "Tell your mom not to get involved with Elijah, please." So Joseph's staff texted his mother and said, "Don't bother getting involved with Elijah. It'll just give you a headache." And the defendant said again, "Tell your mom not to get involved with Elijah." And to be clear, as in like to make phone calls or anything to get him help or anything else like that, please. And Joseph's staff said, "I did it, love." And the defendant responded, "This fucking kid, Joe, I'm gonna end up losing it." Help was available. Your Honor, on September 14th of 2021, just 10 days before Elijah's death and less than a week after Elijah had suffered blunt force trauma injuries to his head, injuries that the medical examiner reviewed in State's Exhibit 14, which is a photograph showing those injuries 7 days later, as well as in the autopsy where they were visible, the medical examiner found that those injuries contributed to cause of death. But on that date, the defendant reiterated on September the 14th, 2021, that she didn't like Joanne's staff talking to people because what was happening was nobody's business. She said that staff should tell Joanne to stop because she wasn't going to be nice about it. The next day, September 15th of 2021, the defendant told Joseph's staff in a moment that shows she knew that Elijah's body was failing. She didn't think he was going to get better. She told him, this kid is seriously fucked up and won't listen, so how will he get better? And Joseph's staff said, "Babe, there's no getting him better. We have to get him like he was before, physically, healthy. His behavior won't change." And the defendant said, "I'm not talking about his behavior. I'm talking about his health and his body. He's not listening. He keeps bending in half, curling in a ball, picking his scabs, pissing and sitting in it, making his wounds worse. He's fucked for life with his fucking head," she said. Joseph said, "I'll do whatever it takes to get him decent because I have to get him gone. He needs to go somewhere that helps kids like him. He's not suitable to be in a family like ours." He said their daughter didn't deserve to live like that. And the defendant said, "Why do you think I keep on top of him with the bending and the picking? He has to stop. He won't fucking get better if he keeps it up. He needs to sit up with his back straight and his head up. He has to work his muscles and strengthen them. Having him flopped over is going to make it worse. He's going to need to stand too, like stand up and sit down, stand up and sit down, work his fucking nasty ass legs." And still, while there was still time, no help was obtained for Elijah. Your Honor, the next day, on September 16th of 2021, the defendant sent the group of text messages that the state read during the guilty plea hearing. A group of text messages that after hearing them, the defendant audibly said that was horrible. Her words about her child. That series of messages, the final one is the only one I'll repeat today. I know the court has heard them. They are horrible. The defendant said, "It's my way now, Joe. My fucking piece of shit kid. I'll do what I want. Not gonna have him disrespect me because Joe gives in. I'll fucking hang the kid." Instead, the defendant abdicated her care of Elijah. Her 5-year-old son became the kid, the maggot, the naked little boy locked in a room and observed over a baby monitor. With that, the defendant could justify his torture, his neglect, his abuse. Defense counsel in their sentencing memorandum refers to a specific instance and say that Joseph's staff lied to investigators. and told them that Danielle struck Elijah's head against tile. No, Your Honor, Mr. Staff told investigators that he came home on September the 21st of 2021. His phone records placed him squarely at Target in Nashua on that date, making phone calls and communicating with the defendant about what they should buy, what they shouldn't buy, whether she liked outfits, whether she thought this brand was the right brand. Mr. Staff described that Ms. Dauphinais stopped responding to him, and he became frantic over that. And the text messages show that. His phone records show that frantic nature. Multiple messages, multiple phone calls, none answered. Joseph Staff said he rushed home. And when he got home, he found the defendant lying in bed with their daughter, and he found Elijah sitting naked in the bathtub. That in and of itself is not unusual. However, he described broken tile being in the tub around Elijah. He described bandaging Elijah's head with a Band-Aid. Defense argues that largely based on an expert witness who was cited by defense who the state moved to preclude at trial. Defense argues that that expert witness shows that Staff's statements were lies. But even the expert witness cited by the defense would not and could not say that Mr. Staff made the incident up. That expert read Mr. Staff's statement. He never listened to it. He never reviewed any corroborating evidence. He didn't know that Mr. Staff's phone placed Mr. Staff at Target on September 21st of 2021. He didn't know that it showed that the defendant cut off communications with Mr. Staff. He didn't know that Mr. Staff had texted and called her, become frantic. He didn't know that Elijah had a cut on his head that was covered by a Band-Aid when his body was found. That expert stated in his report that he could not say whether Mr. Staff's statement was accurate. He testified at a deposition that he would not testify to the truthfulness of a witness as an ultimate opinion in any jurisdiction under any circumstance. And yet in their sentencing memorandum, counsel attempts to use that opinion to do just that. Your Honor, showing State's Exhibit 16. Elijah Lewis was beaten in this bathtub. You can see that there are measurements on the screen that show you that the top of the tub to the ceiling is about 5.7 feet, while the floor to the ceiling in that room is just over 7 feet high. The shelf in the bathroom, which is actually where the narcotics were found stored inside of this apartment, is over almost 6.5 feet above the floor. Your Honor, we know that the victim was beaten in this bathroom. We know that he was housed inside of this bathroom in the bathtub, often naked. We know that from the defendant's words, from the text messages, and from the communications between the two parties. We know that because Joseph Staff confirmed that Elijah Lewis was often naked in that room or isolated in that room. On July the 11th of 2021, months before Elijah died, Joseph Staff was out shopping at a Home Depot. The defendant at that point complained, and I'll read the messages directly, but that Elijah was using a pillow as a bed while he was sleeping in the bathtub. And you know from the messages that follow that he was naked as this was happening. You also know that he was injured. Your Honor, at 2:40 p.m. on July 11th, the defendant said to Joseph Staff, "He doesn't listen to what I tell him to do. What else is new? Fucking using the pillow as a bed and curling up in a ball with his bandage all fucked up and his nasty ass touching the tub. Nasty fucking dirty rotten thing he is." Joseph Staff sent this photograph of a first aid kit, and he said, "Hey, this is $25. I don't think it has much of what we need in it, but it could be good to have." She said, "Is that the best one? We need more ointment and big bandages. I saw it helps with burns." And Joseph Staff said, "Well, this is all they had for first aid stuff. Should I pass on the first aid kit?" And the defendant replied, we need shit right now. We need shit now, right? I'm all out of the ointment. If he didn't get up, we'd be good still." And then she texted moments later, "He got up again." And Joseph Staff said, "Okay, I'll get it, but it's just little packages of ointment." Your Honor, in photographs taken at 7 Sunset Drive, that first aid kit was actually sitting on the stove in the kitchen in the basement apartment. On July 29th of 2021, a few days later, Elijah's still in the bathroom. The defendant sends this message to Joseph Staff. "I hit him in the head with the shower rod. That's all I did. I sprayed him down. You're gonna lose your shit, Joe. Like you're not gonna stop. It's that bad what he did." And then she declared he is to be removed from that fucking bathroom immediately. There's no indication of how long he'd been in there or how long they kept him isolated in that room, Your Honor. But it is clear that that is where Elijah spent his life. Your Honor, when investigators searched the home at 7 Sunset Drive, they noted that the bathroom appeared to have been cleaned up with there were multiple bottles of cleaning solution, and obvious smears on the tile when detectives utilized a chemical enhancer to look for blood. Investigators, however, despite those efforts to clean, located and recovered multiple swabs of suspected blood from the walls, the shower curtain, and the ceiling in the bathtub. Your Honor, they're difficult to see, but there are little white tags all over this bathroom wall that show where these swabs were collected from. All of those swabs contain suspected blood. Your Honor, the dark circle that is there, and as you'll see in all of the photographs that I'm about to go through, which is this State's Exhibit 17A, the dark circle reflects a spot that was actually sent out for DNA testing. Far too many to send out. Some of them were too small because of cleaning. But the dark circle indicates that there was a direct match to a single source profile of Elijah Lewis in the blood at that location. Your Honor, showing State 17B, Elijah Lewis's blood found in the corner of the tub as well as on the back of the shower head attachment. State's Exhibit 17C, Your Honor, showing what we've called sort of the front wall, which is the wall where the shower head and the faucets are. All of the red spots marking locations from which swabs of suspected blood were obtained. The dark circles, again, direct matches to Elijah Lewis. And showing the ceiling, Your Honor. Over 7 feet above the floor, Elijah Lewis's blood was on the ceiling in that bathroom. Your Honor, at this time, the State has victim impact statements that we'd like to present, and then following that, I would intend on turning over the remainder of the argument to Attorney Hageman.
Very good, thank you.
I believe that the first 3 impact statements will be read by an advocate from our office. The first would be a statement of Debbie and Mark Lewis.
And I'll just have you say your full name.
Yes.
Excuse me, and spell your last name for the record.
My name is Amy Cerullo. Last name is spelled Cerullo.
Go right ahead, Mr. Rule.
Okay. Firstly, we want to say thank you from the bottom of our hearts to everyone who is involved in finding Eli, everyone who has provided support and comfort to us over the last 3 years, and everyone who has worked to ensure some degree of justice for Eli. We were able to go to Arizona twice to spend time with our grandson. He was just 2 years old at the time we saw him, and we made memories that we will treasure forever. Playing games in the arcade, watching ostrich races, playing with toys, eating froyo, meals together, laughing and playing. His little hand in mine, the weight of him in my arms, the hugs he gave. We were looking through family photos recently, and we were saddened by the stark contrast between the lives of Eli's older brothers and cousins and the life we now know he had. Eli should have had days out with his grandparents, birthday parties in our backyard, fun vacations with us, getting to know his cousins, second cousins, great-grandparents, his aunts and uncles, and his siblings. He should have had bedtime stories with us, sleepovers, hugs, play, love. That life was taken away from him, and it was taken away from us. The impact of Eli's death on our family is enormous, and to condense it into a few short paragraphs is impossible. We have written and rewritten this statement so many times, and still we don't know how to convey the impact, not just of Eli's death, but what we have learned about his life. The horror we have felt, the anger, the anguish, the disgust. The impact of knowing that people we knew and loved are not the people we believed and hoped they were. The impact of knowing just what people are truly capable of. But this much we can tell you, Eli's death and what we have learned of his life has changed our family forever. True justice for Eli will only be possible when every person involved in his life holds themselves accountable for their choices and the choices that were made that ultimately led to his death. The choices made for Eli make no sense for us. The things done to Eli have horrified and sickened us. The more we have learned in the last 3 years, the harder it has become to understand why he remained with Danielle and how she could do the things she did. The lack of accountability and remorse from the very people who should have kept Eli safe has appalled us. Eli's life was shrouded in secrets, deceit, and lies, blatant lies and lies of omission. We didn't know he was brought to New Hampshire until days after he was left with Danielle. He was driven across the country during the pandemic, and despite passing within a mile of our home, we didn't get to see him ever again. When we learned he was with Danielle, we were told it would just be for a 6-week visit. It's impossible to comprehend how and why that visit turned into months and months of neglect and torture, how it became a lifetime, why no one ever went back to get him. The photos Danielle sent us when we reached out to see how things were going made it appear that Eli was happy and well cared for, and no one told us otherwise. Based on what we were told, we believe that he was doing okay. But we now know that was not the case, and we also know that other people knew at the time that that was not the case. We cannot describe the disbelief, anger, and frustration we have felt when no one reached out to us for help. We have always helped people in any way. Could we have saved Eli from the abandonment, the neglect, the cruelty he suffered? We will never know. We were not given the opportunity, and more importantly, Eli was not given that opportunity. As we move forward from today, we will try to understand, we will try to forgive, but it is very difficult to do so, and we don't know if we can. But what we can do is this. We will remember Eli as we knew him, a toddler full of life, love, hugs, rambunctious, charming, and the biggest of smiles. We will hold memories of Eli softly in our hearts so that he's never truly gone from us. The next statement I have is from Francesca Lewis. Danielle, at one point you said I was like a sister to you. It meant a lot to me, as I'm sure it did to you. You made my family grow and connected us forever when you had Eli. What you put us through is worse than anything I could have ever imagined. Watching my parents grieve the loss of their grandchild has been devastating. Losing my nephew in such a horrific way is unimaginable. You had so many options and you chose the worst one. Why didn't you reach out for help? I would have been there for you. I had always been there for you. That's what sisters do. It didn't matter how much time had passed since we last spoke, but I didn't know anything was wrong. Now I'm left with so many unanswered questions that I believe I'll never know the truth. I will always wonder how much pain Eli was in, both mentally and physically. I will always wonder what his short life was really like, especially his final days. Your actions are what nightmares are made of. You took Eli's life and robbed my family of peace and so much more in the process. I will continue to be reminded of your cruelty each time I reach for a blanket, something that he was denied. Each time I have a headache, which I'm sure Eli experienced plenty, and whenever I'm hungry, as you would not give him any food, and each time I need a hug, which I'm sure Eli craved. You'll never understand how much this impacts our daily lives. This has changed our lives forever. Our family is reminded of this tragedy countless times through happy and sad moments in our life. Happy moments like birthdays and holidays are tinged with pain because we know that Eli will never experience this joy, and we wonder what these kind of days were like when he was alive. Whenever I hear a helicopter, I'm brought back to the search for Eli. All of us have experienced a great deal of anxiety since these events. Anxiety about running into someone who might kindly ask how we're doing, but unknowingly triggers a panic attack. Anxiety which brings on thoughts that wonder what Eli went through, the fear he felt. The entire family is affected by what you did to Eli. My family, I say my because you are not our family anymore. It was you who said I was like a sister to you. Now I'm haunted by that memory, and we are not family anymore.
Thanks again. Appreciate that input.
The last statement I'm reading is from Michaela Lewis. It says,
Looks like she's on the WebEx, by the way.
yes, yep. It says, right now, Eli should be picking out a Halloween costume. His guardian should be mapping out a trick-or-treat route and looking forward to seeing the enjoyment on his face as he goes door to door. That guardian could have been almost anyone had you just asked. I know his father said no, but there are so many other people who would have stepped up to the plate and loved him as their own. I will always wonder what stopped you from doing the right thing. I think of it all the time and how different things could have been for Eli. My daughter is just a month shy of the age Eli would have been when you murdered him. He was just 5 years, 8 months, and how many days? That's one of the many things we still don't know, what day his torture finally ended and he was released from the hell he'd endured in his short life. Why can't you just tell us you have nothing left to lose? I have days out with my children every weekend, and I always wonder whether Eli had the same. Did he get to enjoy farms, parks, zoos, and aquariums? Did he prefer swings or slides? Did he ever see the ocean? Did he ever go sledding on his first winter back to New Hampshire? Did he have hot chocolate and movie nights? Those questions plague me, and I end up racked with guilt for not knowing enough to be able to help. I would have helped Danielle. I know we've not spoken since Eli was a baby, and I live on the other side of the world, but I would have done anything to help Eli, give Eli the life he deserved. The right choice was always available to you, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering why you chose to torture your son rather than reach out to us. Because the whole situation ultimately comes down to choices. Every parental figure in Eli's life made choices that disregarded his safety, health, and happiness. As I sit here typing this, I know my son is sleeping safely tucked into his bed, and my daughter is by my side in comfortable pajamas picking out a bedtime story with her dad. Everyone's tired from a day of bike riding, playgrounds, and a picnic. I cannot imagine putting my comfort over their safety or denying them the basic needs and reasonable wants. It physically pains me to think of either of them cold and alone, feeling unloved or unwanted. I think of that all the time, cold, hungry, and alone with a rotten ulcer. I picture my kids in the dark as Eli was, and I wonder how any human being could let kids suffer that way, especially one of their own. Eli deserved to be loved and cherished, to feel wanted. Every happy memory I make with my children is now tinged with guilt and sadness because Eli doesn't have the opportunity to make happy memories, and that is simply unfair. Danielle, you deserve a much harsher penalty than allowed by law, and I hope today brings some semblance of justice and closure, not to just our respective families, but to everyone involved in Eli's case.
And thank you, Kayla. I appreciate those comments very much.
Your Honor, I believe that I believe that Mr. Tim Lewis is on the WebEx and he has an impact statement he would like to read.
He is. Mr. Lewis, I can't see you yet by way of video feed, but if you turn your video on, I'll allow you to make your victim impact statement, please. Go right ahead, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Your Honor. First, I would like to take a moment to again sincerely thank the detectives and all other law enforcement officers from each of the states involved in seeking justice for my son and the other agencies that were involved. I'm grateful for Amos and Wyatt, the state police dogs that were able to locate my son, even though it brought the worst news a parent could ever imagine. I'm sorry. Trying to get to.
Take your time.
As for you, you don't deserve to hear this. I don't even want to address you. I will always be a voice for my son, though. You have ruined so many lives and taking the life of my son. My wife and I have our parents, who are already lost grandparents. Elijah's siblings, his aunts, uncles, and cousins, all of us that know and love him. All of our lives have been darkened every single day by the fact that he is no longer here with us. Every family event, every milestone will forever be blanketed in sorrow because we never get to make that memory with Eli. Not only do we miss every moment that we did get with him, we also miss every new moment that we won't get to make with him. You stole that away from us. You stole that away from him. You opened on pure evil. You intentionally tortured, starved, beat, and brutally killed a little 5-year-old boy. When you carried and gave birth to him. It's sick. You are absolutely the most pathetic excuse for a person. All you had to do was stop lying and bring him home. At any moment, all of this could have been completely different if you had just brought him home. Elijah had a whole life here with us. A vibrant life in Arizona, a big family that loves him and always made sure he knew. Even if he had a challenging day, we'd be there for him, encourage him, love him, support him every day. And to respond to what my sister said, yeah, he had those great experiences. He went to farms, parks, everything. He did that all with us here, all the time. And every day, even if he had a challenging day, we'd be there and encourage him. Every day is a struggle for myself and my family as we try to navigate living a life without Eli. His siblings, grandparents, extended family love him and miss him more than you could ever imagine. I love him as my son more than you could know. Danielle, even though I feel we are too heartless and too soulless to even comprehend something like this, I wholeheartedly hope that your choices and decisions that you have made for the rest of your days. I also hope each of your days in incarceration is worth going for it, and that everyone you encounter knows exactly what you did and who you are. With every atom of my being, I will never forgive and absolutely never forget what you have done. As a father, what the criminal justice system considers right by law will never really quite show it justice, because I'll never get my son back. You have caused a multitude of pain that has sent shockwaves of sorrow through my family that will last for the rest of our days. It has brought out the worst in people. After what you have done to my son, my parents made the choice to disown me and my family, creating more pain and distance and confusion, leaving that relationship permanently broken. We've also had to encounter people who have misrepresented themselves as relatives when they're actually not, only adding to the confusion and immense suffering that you have caused. You could not begin to imagine the emotional toll that you have done, that what you have done has caused for myself and my family. Most days are completely paralyzed. Losing a child is the worst thing that could ever happen to a parent, let alone in such an awful, unexpected way. It changes how you look at the whole world, and life will never feel the same. You are the very definition of evil, and I hope you never make it out.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I appreciate those comments.
Your Honor.
You're welcome. Attorney Hagan.
Thank you, Judge.
The state hopes, Your Honor, that at this point in the hearing, that there is absolutely no doubt that what the defendant did to Elijah was more than minimal when it comes to murdering a child. There is absolutely nothing minimal about the days, the weeks, the months of assaults, starvation, isolation, and neglect that Elijah suffered. There is nothing minimal about the fact that the defendant spent so much time watching Elijah suffer over a video monitor instead of helping him. There is nothing minimal about the defendant's hatred that she showed towards her son, or all the callous ways that she spoke about him, and that Your Honor has heard probably too many times. We know that Elijah's death was both long and painful. And his murder was not quick. It was not an impulsive act. The defendant was not a parent who lost her temper and reacted all of a sudden. He did not die within hours or days. Instead, it was the result of continuous torture. The defendant violently abused and neglected him over many, many, many months. And over those months, she had to make a series of decisions every single day to terrorize
her 5-year-old son. And those decisions resulted in actions that can be described as nothing other than monstrous. The sentence imposed in this case should reflect the magnitude of her monstrous conduct. And we know that the defendant may spend her time today shifting the blame, shifting it to others, much of what you've already read in her sentencing memorandum. And I will say that that approach is of no surprise to the state. The defendant has repeatedly lied, lies that Your Honor has heard over and over and over, and primarily about Elijah. And all those lies were in hopes that no one would ever discover what happened to that 5-year-old little boy and what she did to him, over and over. And this investigation all started because of the defendant's lies. The lies she told DCYF, the lies she tried to convince others to tell DCYF and law enforcement on her behalf. Her entire goal was to lie and deceive and to shift the blame. Because otherwise, she would have to face the reality of what she did and what she's responsible for. She's going to blame Elijah as a challenging child with behavioral problems, toileting problems. Elijah's challenges fueled her animosity towards him. She used those challenges as a reason to deprive him food, clothing, reasons to violently assault him, a reason to withhold the most basic needs of a 5-year-old boy. And those challenges, what they tell us, Judge, is that he was especially vulnerable. He was in a position completely reliant on the defendant. In her sentencing memorandum, she spends time indicating how her own mother didn't protect her and how she was betrayed by her own parental figures. She, too, did the same thing to her son. Rather than protect her very young and very vulnerable son, she blamed him. Vulnerabilities that make her actions even more cruel and reprehensible, and in no way mitigates what she did to him. She will point to Joseph's staff to say she shouldn't be sentenced any differently than him, that they are both equally responsible. But as Your Honor knows, as the presiding judge over Joseph's staff, he had his day in this courtroom years ago, pre-indictment. And the court is very familiar with the difference in Joseph's staff's role in Elijah's staff. While his conduct was nothing less than reprehensible, he shed light on what happened to Elijah, and he shared that information with law enforcement. And that it was information that was verified by physical evidence, information that was verified by the defendant's own words, information of Joseph's staff's phone over the course of the last month of Elijah's life placed him outside the home primarily, and the defendant primarily being the one in the home. Staff working, purchasing drugs in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and running errands for the family. These things corroborated what Joseph's staff told law enforcement. He took responsibility. He expressed remorse. He was accountable for his actions. And he's already serving a very lengthy sentence. But today is about Danielle Dauphinais. Today is about this defendant and her heinous actions. The defendant's going to point to her childhood as a mitigating factor. Because of her childhood, though, Judge, she was in the best position to know and understand the impacts of the abuse and neglect, the impact of what she did to Elijah. And yet, she disregarded her own life experiences because she didn't view Elijah as her son. She viewed him as less than, watching him suffer day after day through a video monitor. And although defense counsel provided no documentation for the defendant's background, even if we accepted her statements as true, she tells us several things. One, she survived her abuse and neglect. Elijah did not. She was taken to the hospital to get a cast when her arm was broken. Elijah wasn't taken to the hospital for his injuries. She told us she was able to run away from home. Elijah couldn't run away. He couldn't even walk. The types of abuse and neglect that she suffered are the same types of abuse and neglect that she perpetrated on her own son. The defendant's childhood is not a mitigating factor. It is an aggravating factor, and that is how you should see it. In the state's sentencing memorandum, we provided several other homicide cases for Your Honor to review. Those were meant to be guideposts, and they were intended to be informative. But we all know from practicing that there are no two cases that are alike, and there are no two defendants that are alike. Elijah's death was more egregious than those cases we cited, for your honor. Those other child homicide cases did not have the months and months of torture that happened to Elijah. Those other homicide cases did not involve extended incidents of physical assault combined with months-long of psychological maltreatment, starvation, isolation. None of those cases had a cause of death that included drugs or poisoning alongside physical trauma, medical neglect, and malnourishment. None of them had fentanyl intoxication, as suffered by Elijah. Why is this case different? The defendant spent minutes, hours, days, weeks, months torturing her son. He wasn't murdered in an instant or a short period of time. This was a long and painful death. As Dr. Christian wrote in her report and would have likely testified, Elijah's mother and her boyfriend inflicted ongoing severe abuse, leading to the prolonged suffering of this young, helpless child who they dehumanized. This represents the most severe form of child maltreatment. We know the defendant's true motives in this case, and you know that from all of the statements that you've heard. There are numerous statements that she sent to Joseph's staff, ones that were presented at the plea hearing, some presented today, and some that I intend to go over. These statements she made thinking no one would ever hear them besides Joseph's staff. Photos that she sent to him thinking no one would ever see them. On a phone she discarded, but recovered from Joseph's staff's phone. These statements and photos reflect her true intentions. Intentions of a woman that thought no one would go looking for her son. The next slides show the progression of Elijah's condition. And we know that from the defendant's own words. And you'll see over the course of the progression of these slides, Your Honor, the changes in Elijah's body. In some of the photos, you'll be able to see injuries like a black eye, but towards the end, you'll see the significant loss of weight and muscle. Now, these photos and messages come from States Exhibit 12 and 13, and I know Your Honor has reviewed them. Look at this fucking kid's face. I had to be easy on Elijah today because of what's going on, so I gave him a bubble bath with toys. I fucking hate this kid. I want to kill him. I want him dead. I woke up at 9:38 and he wasn't standing, so I moved the camera and there he was, laying on the floor with the blankets you took away. This fucking kid was screaming, and of course your mom didn't go to work. It's been a fucking nightmare. Elijah kept fucking crying and wouldn't shut the fuck up. He said he feels like he's never gonna drink again. He's such a fucking asshole. That's all he fucking cares about. I go in his room and tell him to stop crying, and he says, "But Mom, I can't hold it anymore." I can't wait to take the belt to his ass. Dude, I'm gonna fuck this kid up. He ain't eating shit today. He had plenty boogers and crusty, moldy yogurt. And all this kid does is cry because he's fucking hungry. I gave him a small bowl of cereal so he could shut the fuck up, but that wasn't enough. He said he wants food, and he wants me to stop starving him because it's not nice. Joe, I can't be near him anymore. It's gonna be bad. Once you left, Elijah started to cry and said, "I'm thinking I'm gonna eat. I'm not gonna eat. I want to fucking kill this piece of shit. I can't be near him or I'll fuck him up. I'm gonna kill this kid, Joe," fucking screaming on the top of his lungs for fucking water, and woke JS and I up. I'm going to kill him, and I mean it. I'm going to bang out this child. Just whooped the maggot's ass. And states 14, the last photo of Elijah. This photo, Your Honor, at the top shows the progression of what Elijah looked like. The top left is his in-life photo, and then the bottom is the last photo of him, with many of the messages that we've gone through. In preparing for the recommendation in this case, Your Honor, the state considered the important factors of sentencing: punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation. The state considered that the defendant pled guilty, which she did on the eve of trial. And Your Honor does have broad discretion in sentencing. And you do have to consider the goals of sentencing. However, you don't have to weigh each of those goals of sentencing equally, especially when a particular case or a particular defendant warrants giving more weight to one of the goals of sentencing. The New Hampshire Supreme Court has even recognized as a valid sentencing factor the need to impose a particular sentence in order to instill confidence in the criminal justice system. The court observed in State v. Darcy that public confidence in the system of justice is an important consideration. It is important that this community have confidence in the criminal justice system. This community has, as you've heard from some of Elijah's family members, this community came unhinged when they learned of Elijah's disappearance and ultimately his death. A heinous murder of a vulnerable 5-year-old little boy. This is the type of crime that the community looks to and looks to the criminal justice system for a fair administration of what is required to be imposed in a case like this. Now, there's nothing that can bring back Elijah. There is nothing that can undo the abuse and neglect that he suffered. But what can be accomplished? A just sentence. One that imposes a punishment that reflects how heinous of a crime the defendant committed. How devastating child abuse and neglect is in our community. When they found Joseph Staff's pickup truck in Mohegan Sun Casino, they found trash bags that had some of Elijah's stuff. A Spider-Man doll, some belongings of his with childlike handwriting, states 6D and 6F. They were discarded, just like Elijah, in a trash bag. Elijah deserved to have a hero. He deserved for his father, mother, stepfather to all have been heroes. But now he has this community to be his hero. The men and women in law enforcement, many of who are sitting in this courtroom, many from across the country. They did not let the defendant's lies or deceit or destruction of evidence stop them. They spent days, weeks, months trying to find out what happened to this little boy. And when they discovered what happened to him, they learned that it was nothing short of monstrous. And there is nothing that the defendant could say today that would justify what she did to this little boy. She may try to say, as she did in her sentencing memorandum, that she was an ill-equipped parent. She had terrible decision-making. Well, Judge, ill-equipped parents, they get help for their kids. They don't murder them. Terrible decision-making is like overreacting when your child does something they're not supposed to do. But this was months of decision-making. Decision-making to torture her son. Like she told Joe Staff, it was her kid. She was the boss, and she was going to do what she wanted. And she did exactly what she told Joe Staff she was going to do. She killed him. And what she did was so depraved and so reprehensible. He spent days, weeks, and months to get to this condition. This community has been changed forever. And this is not a case that you can forget. And she should spend every day of every week, of every month, of every year thinking about this little boy, her own son. Elijah is not a little boy that anyone in this community will ever forget. And although there is no number that will make this just or fair, the number of years that she spends in prison should reflect the magnitude of the heinous crimes she committed. Elijah should have had a long and full life, and she took that all away from him in a cruel way. She murdered a vulnerable 5-year-old little boy. She tortured him, she starved him, she abused him, and he was drugged. The state's recommended sentence is appropriate because it ensures that she spends every day of the rest of her natural life thinking about Elijah Lewis. The state anticipates that the defendant is going to argue, as they did in their sentencing memorandum, for the minimum. That she should get what Joseph Staff or people like Adam Montgomery got. And she uses those as comparables. And it's as if she's saying, I'm not worse than them. But we know the facts of this case are worse. The months of torture is worse. There is nothing minimal about what happened to Elijah Lewis. This 5-year-old little boy deserved a hero. And this community needs to know and have confidence that young, vulnerable children will be kept safe. And if someone subjects a small, vulnerable child to this type of behavior, that they will receive a punishment that fits the crime. Elisha was a very young child with no support, and arguably one of the most vulnerable in our community. But yet the person most responsible for his care, his own mother, was the person who caused him the most harm. And because of that, the defendant's sentence should reflect the magnitude of the harm she caused. For all the reasons that we've stated both on the record, both at the plea and sentencing hearing, and also in our sentencing memorandum, we're asking that you impose the sentence of 55 years to life on the second-degree murder charge. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. We're going to take just a brief break before we start the defendant's presentation. So we'll break to 12:15 at this point, and then we'll return to the defendant's presentation. Thank you.
All right.
I'll go.
Yeah,
I'll go.
yeah,
I'm going to go.
The defense for their presentation. Looks like it's Attorney Faulkner.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
Your Honor, out of all the words in the state's presentation, the ones that struck me the most were two words: she survived. That's true only in a physical sense, Your Honor. She's here in the courtroom. But the events of this case very much demonstrate that she did not truly survive. Your Honor has a very thorough history of the kinds of abuse that she suffered as a child. And the state is absolutely right when they say she too did the same thing. That's exactly all the kinds of things that happened to Ms. Dauphinais as a child, growing up, were all the kinds of ways of controlling children that were taught to her. That's the way that she was taught how to be a parent. And it's not the right way to be a parent. I think if there's one word that could sum up this entire case, it would be the word nightmare. The nightmare that Elijah Lewis went through during all of his days, particularly at the end, but during all of his days. The nightmare of all of the family that lived in that home, including Ms. Dauphinais. The nightmare that Ms. Dauphinais suffered throughout her entire life growing up. And the nightmares that she has every night when she's haunted by her son. Timothy Lewis, in his letter to the court, talked about how he wished that she would be haunted by him. She has. Every night she has nightmares about the death of her son. That, by the way, the state suggests that she tries to shift the blame away from herself, and she doesn't. She takes full and complete responsibility for what she has done. She knew that her treatment of her son would lead to her death, and it did. That does not mean, however, that all of the ways that the state suggested it happened were true, because they weren't. Timothy Lewis brought Elijah to New Hampshire, having sketched very barely the kinds of behaviors that Elijah was having. But behaviors isn't really the right word, and Your Honor has access to the medical evidence, and I'm not going to get into the medical diagnoses here in the courtroom because those are in medical records, but I'll leave it at this. There were severe psychiatric issues. Those psychiatric issues were so severe that Mr. Lewis was told to get a psychiatric evaluation. Instead of doing that, he just dropped Elijah off with Danielle Dauphinais. Now, those psychiatric issues are in no way a justification for Danielle's behavior. That's not the point, Your Honor. Those psychiatric behaviors were so serious that Timothy Lewis told a DCF worker that he couldn't take Elijah back because he was concerned about the safety of his own children. And that was in November of 2020. So this idea that it's just simply not true that Elijah simply just had behaviors. Elijah was a safety threat in the home, and Danielle Dauphinais had a responsibility as his parent, as did Timothy Lewis. They both had a responsibility to get the psychiatric help that he needed, and neither of them did that. And Ms. Dauphinais takes full responsibility for that and a whole lot more. She has a letter to address the court, and if she has the ability to do it, she's going to be directly addressing the court and reading it to Your Honor. This has been very emotional for her, and to the extent that she's unable, Attorney Jerusalem will read the letter for her if necessary, but she's certainly going to try to read it. I would note that at the time when Ms. Dauphinais became the most emotionalized during the state's presentation, it was seeing the picture of Elijah at the end. It was seeing what she had done to him. She understands that. And again, it haunts her to all of her days. I would suggest that she has complete and deep remorse for what she has done. She knows, Your Honor, that the things that were done to her were the things that she did, except for worse. And the problem, Your Honor, is that for a normal, I shouldn't say normal, for somebody who hasn't had the kind of destructive childhood that she suffered from, think about some of the things that she has gone through, talking about being left out in the cold, waiting for her father to come home, who she's never met, being basically dropped off by one parent, abandoned to another parent, and then not even being picked up, sitting outside in the cold. Leaving a child in the cold is one of the things that Elijah died of, and it's one of the things that was done to Danielle. Regular physical abuse was something that Danielle suffered in multiple homes, from her stepfather to her real father to foster placements. These are the kinds of ways that she learned how to control a child. But those things don't ever work with a normal child. Some of the studies that Your Honor has in the sentencing memorandum demonstrate that. Those don't teach children to behave. They only make children's behavior worse, to the point where they're intergenerational. And that's exactly what has happened in this case. And they didn't help Elijah get better. They didn't correct his behavior. They made it worse. And then when his behavior got worse, her parenting got worse. She didn't handle the situation correctly in any stretch of the imagination, and she's aware of that, and that's what led, ultimately, to Elijah's death. But not in the way that the state says that it did. The state, now, in this presentation, says, well, it was all of these things that helped kill Elijah. But when you go back and listen to the change of plea hearing, they were very focused on Joseph Staff's statement that he's out shopping one night and he comes home and Elijah's lying in the bathtub. We see from Staff's interview that he says that that happened and the bathtub is full of the tiles. She broke the tiles, and he says it a couple of different ways. And there's no dispute that he went to Target one night, but that doesn't prove that the tiles were broken. Your Honor has, in the sentencing memorandum, pictures of those broken tiles many months before Elijah died. Many months before this supposed incident that broke the tiles. And in those contemporaneous messages, it's clear that Elijah was banging his head. Now, theoretically, we don't know for sure whether Danielle Dauphinais was telling the truth at that time, but she's telling people overtly, contemporaneously, in July of 2021, that he's hitting his head against the shower tiles. And that's consistent with all of the behaviors that he does suffer from. And in the emails that you see with Timothy Lewis, those behaviors didn't start when he came to New Hampshire. So when the state began its presentation at the change of plea hearing, it said, Elijah arrived in New Hampshire happy and healthy. Here's a picture of him happy and healthy when he arrives in the state of New Hampshire. But he wasn't happy and he wasn't healthy. He hadn't lost the weight at that point, so certainly he was much more unhealthy by the time he died, but he was neither happy nor healthy. He had low weight, he had psychiatric issues, he had behavioral issues, he had aggressive behaviors. He was a danger in Timothy Lewis's home, just as he became a danger to the young child in Danielle Dauphinais and Joe Staff's home. And again, none of that justifies violence against him. He needed psychiatric evaluation, he needed psychiatric help. And Danielle Dauphinais did try to get some of that help. The state says, oh, well, he's on, she tried to enroll him in the New Hampshire medical system, but he had an actual health insurance, a private health insurance. And that's very well demonstrated, and she couldn't get that information. That doesn't justify not bringing him to the doctor, but what it does do is it helps explain how she's acting in the time that she's acting. When she's not bringing him to the doctor, she's pestering Timothy Lewis for that insurance information. The state suggests that she actually wanted Elijah Lewis dead in September and October of 2020. And at that very time, she's pestering Timothy Lewis for the insurance information so that she can bring him in to get him help. She didn't want him dead at that point. She wanted to get him a psychiatric evaluation. Why would she continue to ask for the health insurance information if she wasn't trying to get him in. And Timothy Lewis's response to all of that is, no, that's my private family information. He doesn't provide the health insurance, and she's unable to get it done. And should she have done more? The answer is yes. Should she have just brought him in anyways? The answer is yes. But we're talking about somebody who doesn't have the life skills, who doesn't have the social skills, and who has a long history of severe abuse in multiple ways. And a long history of abandonment in multiple ways. Much the same way that Elijah Lewis was abandoned by every adult in his life. Danielle Dauphinais was abandoned by every adult in her life. It's interesting that the state criticizes her because the only character reference she has is from Bruce Scherzer. And the state says you should just totally ignore that letter. And I don't know that I would characterize it as a character reference. Your Honor has the email and can review it. But the state says, well, she's in communication with him all that time. The state provides no communication where she suggested to him what he should write in that letter, in that email. No communication. There's been basically no communication between the two in the time running up to the trial. And there's no suggestion that she has anything to do with the contents of that email. But what that email does, and what it's important for, is it helps demonstrate. He was a friend of her brother John, and he witnessed the kinds of behaviors that her parents had, the dad had, and witnessed the kind of abuse that John suffered, and witnessed the kind of abuse that Danielle suffered. And that's some support. And I don't think that's something that Your Honor should just toss aside as the state suggests. But it's important for another reason. It helps demonstrate, Your Honor, the fact that this is a person who knows that everybody in her life will abandon her sooner or later. Her own sister, Tracy Dauphinais, who she's been in close contact with the whole time and had promised to write a letter for Your Honor, recently got back to me, and she was too busy taking care of her children. That's what she said. She's got appointments. She doesn't have time to write a letter on behalf of her sister, who's facing a sentencing for murder. So it's not just the physical abuse. It's the emotional abuse. It's the abandonment. Not having time to simply write a letter to the court to tell them who your sister is before your sister faces a sentencing where the choices are between a life sentence with parole eligibility in just under 40 years and a life sentence with parole eligibility in just under 60 years. And Tracy Dauphinais couldn't be bothered to write that letter on behalf of her own sister to give Your Honor some more perspective on who she is and who Your Honor is sentencing. Now, in terms of the medical evidence, the state says that the only evidence the defendant has that Joe Staff is lying is the expert report. But that's not true. It's a combination of a number of factors, Your Honor. And Dr. Dickinson does not say Joe Staff was lying. Dr. Dickinson says that that information was suggested in suggestive interviewing techniques, and that information was not information that originally came from Joe Staff, having reviewed all of his interviews with the police, and that the source of that information first came from investigators before Joe Staff said it. That's what Dr. Dickinson says. That is a suggestive interviewing technique, and according to Dr. Dickinson, those statements are therefore potentially unreliable. That doesn't mean that they're not true in and of itself. But we know that there are no injuries to the skull or the spine. We don't know for sure whether there are injuries to the brain inside. The state's correct about that. But what we do know is that there are no defects to the skull itself. And the state has no medical evidence that supports Joe Staff's story that she was bashing Elijah's head against the bathroom tiles shortly before his death. I would suggest, Your Honor, that, again, Dr. LaPosada's report, Your Honor, has, and it's interesting, the state likes to rely on it to the extent that it thinks that it hurts Danielle, but it doesn't like to rely on it for its real conclusions, which are basically that the cause of death is this being locked in the bathroom, being left alone, She doesn't say anything about the cause of death being physical injuries. And I think that's a really important point because all of the comparators that the state provides to Your Honor involve deaths that are caused by physical injuries. And it's not the physical injuries that cause the death here. It is the neglect. It is the abandonment. It is the punishing him by leaving him in the bathroom. And Dr. La Posada makes that very clear. Again, that's not an excuse. It doesn't mean that she didn't knowingly cause the death, and it doesn't justify it. But it helps Your Honor to understand what happened to Elijah Lewis and what Danielle Dauphinais did and what she didn't do. The state suggested that I would get up here and say that this wasn't Danielle's fault. Not at all. And neither will Ms. Dauphinais. She's not going to get up here and say that this is not her fault. She's pleaded guilty to knowingly killing her child. Of course it's her fault, but it's a lot of people's fault as well. The state keeps coming back to this idea that there's nothing minimal about what happened to Elijah Lewis. Of course there's nothing minimal about that. We're talking about the death of a 5-year-old child, and we're talking about a terrible and horrific death. But that does not mean that Danielle Dauphinais is something different than these other defendants in the other cases. And that's what the state is trying to do here, is say that she's something different. This particular murder is different than other murders, and it's not necessarily. I mean, it is in the sense of how it happened. The facts of the case are different, but that's always the case. But it's not some particularly egregious scheme by Danielle Dauphinais. When you read all of those text messages, and the state has presented them, you're reading text messages and Facebook messages sent out of desperation. She's desperate in those months. She's been in that apartment for 18 months. She almost never leaves. They talk about Elijah being in the house all the time, but she's essentially in the house all the time as well. She's caring for a young child, much younger than Elijah. She's trying to keep that child safe from Elijah's behaviors. She's pregnant, late in pregnancy. She's abusing heroin and fentanyl. And so, once again, it's not a justification in any way, but what it is a mitigating circumstance. We're talking about somebody who is under the influence of substances, under the influence of a medical condition, who is desperate, who's trying to take care of somebody who she can't take care of. And she should have reached out more to other people for help. There's no question. But she was not making good decisions. She was making bad decisions. And she was making the kinds of bad decisions she had spent her whole life learning to make. The kinds of things that were done to Ms. Dauphinais put her in a position to make these kinds of bad choices. And that doesn't mean the choices weren't hers. But they made it a lot more difficult for her to make other choices. They made it a lot more difficult for her to know what to do to fix the situation. And those terrible circumstances are, as I said at the very beginning, a nightmare. A nightmare for her and a nightmare for everybody. The state criticizes Danielle Dauphinais for pointing to Joe Staff as a comparator. And quite frankly, in a lot of ways, his sentence was far too light. But that's what the state chose to offer him. Joe Staff, the state presents almost as if he was some kind of innocent bystander. The man who's outside working. We know he's not outside working. He might be running down to Lawrence to get drugs. And he might be running errands at Target, but he's not at work. We know that. And he is involved in the physical abuse. He's involved in beating Elijah Lewis. He's involved in all of those things. He's the one that buries the body. It's the conduct is terrible, but it's a murder case. We know that. And I would suggest, again, the court has as much of a duty to be fair in its sentences as it does to demonstrate to the community what its sentence is. And I'm not asking for Joe Staff's sentence here. As I pointed out in the sentencing memorandum, she will serve decades more than Joseph Staff, and she is facing a life sentence, no matter what. The question is whether the sentence that the state wants is sufficient but not greater than necessary. She's 38 years old. She's been in custody for approximately 3 years, a little over. So if you add 58 and a half years to 35, you get something in your late 90s that she becomes parole eligible. That might as well be life without parole. The sentence that the defense seeks is a substantial sentence, not a minimal sentence. It may be the statutory minimum for the murder of a child, but it is not in any way a minimal sentence. 35 years old at the time of her arrest, approximately, plus 38 and a half years, with no earned time credit, puts her parole eligible at the earliest after being 70-something years old, well beyond her childbearing years, well beyond the time that she's going to be taking care of other children. And she shouldn't be taking care of children. She wasn't, aside from the child she had with Joe Staff, almost all of those children sooner or later ended up with other people. And so I would expect that if she were ever to be granted parole, which would only be a conditional release at any rate, she wouldn't be able to have children, she wouldn't be able to take care of children, and I can't imagine any way that she would be released without a condition that she's not taking care of children. We're talking about an extremely long period of time. Now, okay, just a moment, Your Honor. Yes, two more things I'd like to address with Your Honor before, if I could then just have a quick break to speak with my client and co-counsel. But the first is, the state has suggested that Ms. Dauphinais is blaming Elijah, and that's also simply not true. Nobody, not the defense, not the state, not anybody, is suggesting that Elijah deserved to die because of his behaviors, or deserved any mistreatment at all. That's not the point, Your Honor. The point is that he had untreated conditions that put pressure on somebody that didn't have the ability to deal with it. It's not the behaviors that are in and of themselves the problem. It's Ms. Dauphinais' inability to cope with those behaviors that has her here before Your Honor. It's her inability to parent correctly, to get him the help that he needs. And again, she's not the only one that didn't get him the help he needed, but she certainly is responsible at the end. The last point that I would like to make, Your Honor, is with regard to the timing of the plea. The state says, oh, well, she waited until the eve of trial to plead. We had begun plea negotiations just when her most other co-counsel left the case. Attorney Jerushin was new to the case. We moved to continue the trial, not just to prepare for trial, but to give time for Attorney Jerushin to effectively participate in plea negotiations, to get up to speed so that we could negotiate a plea. We didn't wait until the last minute to just do this. We were trying to get it done before, and we wanted more time to be able to negotiate the plea. And that's not Ms. Dauphinais' fault. The state agreed to the capped plea only within 24 hours before, I think even less, before Ms. Dauphinais agreed to accept it. So I would suggest that any idea that she's not taking responsibility because of the timing of her plea is just simply incorrect. We wanted the time, we needed the time, and she absolutely takes full responsibility. And Your Honor will have a chance to determine her remorse or lack of remorse as you hear from her. I do point out, before I consult with them, I think it's really important. Both Joe Staff and Danielle Dauphinais in the immediate aftermath of Elijah Lewis's death clearly engaged in behavior that demonstrated a lack, or at least an apparent lack of care for Elijah Lewis. And I think, as you'll hear from Ms. Dauphinais, a lot of that behavior, again, is sourced in all of the pressure that was on her at the end. And all of that pressure was relieved, and I don't mean relieved in a sense of feeling good, but it was outletted. She no longer had that pressure on her, and again, she's highly intoxicated at the time. She is on a regular basis. She's just had the child that they've left at the hospital, and she's now had the benefit of 3 years of sobriety. She's had I won't call it a benefit, she's had 3 years of being visited nightly by the ghost of her son. And she is clearly remorseful for her conduct and accepts full responsibility for her role in Elijah Lewis's death. I have just a moment, Your Honor.
Yes, you may. Take your time.
Before I conclude, I know it's in the sentencing memo, but I just want to briefly touch on Danielle Dauphinais' background again, because, again, she's the one that Your Honor is sentencing, and she's the one that Your Honor has to determine who deserves the appropriate sentence. And although Elijah Lewis's memory is extremely important in these proceedings, at the end of the day, the decision has to be made. What is an appropriate punishment for Danielle Dauphinais? So I just want to briefly go through that. Her mother, Kathleen, Your Honor, is who she originally starts growing up with, is abusing alcohol and controlled substances. She's using heroin as well. She is using those in front of Danielle Dauphinais as a young child. She's doing that to the point where she is conducting prostitution activities to fund her drug use. She's doing those in front of Danielle Dauphinais. She's telling Danielle Dauphinais the kinds of things that Danielle's saying in some ways about her own son. She's told she's worthless, she's a burden, she never wanted her. This is Danielle Dauphinais' mother who's telling her these things. Kathleen's boyfriend, Mark, also a drug addict, is beating her, passing out, cracked his head on the kitchen table. She's the one that had to call 911 for help, even though she's the child. Mark is beating her mother in front of her. There's verbal and physical abuse at all times. The police are always there. Her mother gets into a drunk driving crash while she's in the car. Her mother is feeding her alcohol-spiked Jell-O shots. So inappropriate feeding behaviors are the kinds of things that she grows up with. And it's inappropriate feeding that she's doing to Elijah Lewis. She's not giving him food when he should get food. And understanding some of the reasons for that, I think, are important. She is, when people do things without permission, they get beaten. So that's the kind of thing that she learned. So when Elijah Lewis does something when he's not supposed to, he gets beaten. That's something that Danielle Dauphinais learns from her childhood. Her brother John is beaten. It's the first time she's seen her big brother cry. And some of that abuse is confirmed by Bruce Schertzer. She's unable to protect herself from inappropriate touchings as well. Fortunately, that doesn't appear to have been in any way involved in her treatment of Elijah Lewis, but there is evidence in the case that she's complaining to people that Elijah is inappropriately touching her daughter. So again, there are echoes of Danielle's past and what happens when she has Elijah Lewis in her home. her biological father, Frank Dauphinais, beats them when she gets placed into foster care. As soon as she gets into a stable environment, Frank Dauphinais brings her home, and then, of course, immediately returns to the same kinds of behaviors. He takes the family out of Massachusetts, where she's in the DCF system, and rips her out of that and brings her to New Hampshire, where she's no longer subject to DCF, and she no longer gets the counseling that she needs. The only place that she's ever received love and care is in these foster homes. And everything that she does in this case is role modeled by the adults in her life, the same adults that abandoned her, and in the same ways that she treats her son and abandons her own son. So you could almost hold a mirror up from Danielle Dauphinais' childhood to the way that she treats Elijah Lewis. And again, I would close in the very place where I began. According to the state, she survived. I humbly submit that she did not. She will most likely spend the entire rest of her life in prison, haunted every day by what she did to her son and haunted by the ghost of her son. That's not surviving.
And does she wish to speak at this point?
Yes, Your Honor, we're just trying to determine whether or not she can maintain her composure. If not, I will read her statement.
And if you need a break for that, I think you do a break for that, whatever you would prefer.
I think if that would be best, Your Honor, if possible.
We have 5 minutes, Your Honor.
We'll take 5 to 10 minutes and then be right back.
Thank you. All right.
And I'll turn back to you.
Thank you, Your Honor. She is going to make an effort to read the letter, her letter of acceptance of responsibility. She's asking permission if she could stand next to both her counsel. She's uncomfortable to be at the podium. The court will permit that.
She can stand or sit as she wants in terms of reading the statement.
All right. Thank you, Your Honor.
You're welcome.
The reason why I'm standing before you today, Your Honor, is due to my actions and choices that led to my 5-year-old son, Elijah's death. All the agony that my son encountered, neglect, mistreatment, isolation, and malnourishment was horrible. No child should ever have to go through any, and in particular, that kind of abuse. Especially my son that I Especially my son that I worked so hard to find when his father took him away from me. I, of all people, should know because that's what happened to me in many similar ways. I also was neglected, mistreated, isolated, and malnourished by my parents and their partners. I am so lucky to be alive. I was also sexually abused by people who were supposed to protect me. Even so, Elijah never deserved any of the abuse. Parents are supposed to take care of their children. I don't deserve my abuse either. I was lucky that I had some time in foster care with wonderful people who gave me a glimpse of better role modeling. If I could have remained with them, I truly feel like my life could have gone in a better direction because I saw a life that I had never known. Sorry. Hold on, Your Honor. Let me go back. I truly feel like life could have gone in another direction before I saw a life that I had never known. Even with Elijah's behavioral issues, his death should never have happened, and I wish that I could have could have done better and take it all back. I didn't know how to make better decisions at the time. When Elijah was dropped off with me by his father unexpectedly, I hadn't seen Elijah since he was 1 year old. Even though I tried to find him for a long time, when his father dropped him off with me for what was supposed to be a couple of months, He didn't tell me the issues that he had been experienced with Elijah. I tried getting Elijah help, but it was impossible because of all these obstacles in my path. His father, Timothy Lewis, wouldn't give me his insurance information to get him services. I brought him to the emergency room at the Elliott Hospital because he was eating feces and I didn't know what to do. I told the hospital about it. I told the hospital what was happening. They fed him snacks and they discharged him without any advice to me and about what to do in the future. Me and Joseph's staff picked him up the next morning. I didn't feel like the Elliott Hospital helped me with what I needed to understand about how to help Elijah with what was going on with him. DCYF was involved at the time. When they learned about the Elliott Hospital emergency room visit, when I was trying to help Elijah, I told them that Elijah needed to be put in foster care because I didn't know how to help him. They told me that I was a bad mother for suggesting it. I know even then that Elijah needed help and I couldn't provide him. The only person in my life that I could turn to advice was my sister. I'm sorry. Tracy for help. Tim Lewis, Elijah's dad, Tracy made a plan for my sister to adopt Elijah. I don't know how to deal with Elijah's behavior's issues, and I didn't have. Sorry, Your Honor. I did not have the financial resources to give him the medical or psychiatric care that he clearly needed because his father wouldn't give me his insurance information. At this point, I was pregnant, also caring for 1.5-year-old. And his father, who had raised him for 3 years, was unwilling to take him back. Me and him communicated back and forth, but Elijah's dad did not send the necessary paperwork to my sister in time to make this happen. I did not know what to do. I was also deep in my addiction and not making great choices. Such as not contacting DCUF to get the help Elijah needed because I was afraid that my daughter and my unborn baby they can't do it.
May I take over your
Yes, go right ahead.
I'm going to go to the back paragraph just because I think a lot of that was lost. The only person in my life that I could turn to for advice was my sister Tracy for help. Tim Lewis, Elijah's dad, Tracy and me made a plan for my sister to adopt Elijah. I didn't know how to deal with Elijah's behavioral issues, and I did not have financial resources to get him the medical or psychiatric care that he clearly needed because his father would not give me his insurance information. At that point in time, I was pregnant, also caring for a 1.5-year-old, and his father, who had raised him for 3 years, was unwilling to take him back. Me and him communicated back and forth, but Elijah's dad did not send the necessary paperwork to my sister in time to make this happen. I didn't know what to do. I was also deep into my addiction and not making great choices, such as not contacting DCYF to get the help that Elijah needed because I was afraid that my daughter and my unborn baby would also be taken from me. That's how my parents handled it, with avoiding contact with DCF in my home state. Looking back now, I should have reached out to DCF, but I felt such shame about myself that I couldn't figure out how to help him. Every day, I think about what if I had only been able to find the strength and the ability to do so. Elijah would still be alive and safe today. If I had contacted DCYF, I would have been able to be on a path to bettering my life and his, getting out of my toxic relationship with Joe, and then working on getting all of my kids back, including Elijah, through sobriety and therapy. But I chose not to because I was so broken at the time, using drugs, and felt such shame because of my Elliott Hospital experience. When Elijah passed away, I know that it looked like I didn't care or have remorse. I did. But I was dealing with so much at that time that my judgment was extremely overwhelmed by my own trauma and untreated mental health issues. I was pregnant and on bed rest, and I was still using drugs. I've been sober for 3 years. I will live with the guilt and sadness that I participated in allowing my son to die. There will never be a day in my life when I will not feel shame and remorse about it. I wish that I could have made better choices. But now that you know about my upbringing, I hope you know that you understand that the people in my life who were supposed to protect me also failed me and gave me very awful examples of how a parent is supposed to behave. These people were my role models. Even so, I want the court to know that I'm truly remorseful for what I did. I always dreamed about having a family and making a safe home for them in a way that I never had. I had really wanted and hoped to do better than my parents did for me. I also want to say that I am sorry to those that I let down, but most of all, to the one person who can't hear me ever again. I'm so sorry, Elijah, that I failed you as your mother. I love you.
Thank you. Anything further from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
And any response?
Your Honor, the state has presented numerous amounts of evidence throughout these proceedings. The court has indicated that you have reviewed the records to the extent that you have them, all of the evidence in this case. And the state believes that the sentence that she is asking for does show leniency to this defendant because she has avoided by this guilty plea a sentence of life without parole. The state asks this court to impose the sentence as requested.
I'll take the matter under advisement. I still want to review all my notes and obviously take a look back at these presentations and some of these exhibits and tailor a fair, just, and appropriate sentence. That will take me about an hour to do, so I expect I'll be returning right around 2:15 with these three sentences in this matter. All right, thank you, everybody.
All rise.
Just a few things before we get started with the actual sentencing. First of all, I want to make clear that in terms of the plea and plea agreement circumstances, as well as the taking of the plea, and the timing of it right before trial, that has nothing to do with my sentencing. It's not pertinent or relevant to the sentencing. Cases are resolved very quickly. Cases are quite often resolved on the eve of the trial. The end result was a cap plea and now a sentence. The other thing I want to do, because I've been involved with the attorneys for quite a long period in this case, is to thank both Attorney Hageman, Attorney Bruno, Attorney Faulkner, and Attorney Kirschman for your professionalism, for your civility, for the way that you presented yourself at all times in this case, including today. It was very important that I be educated as to the criminal behavior in this case, be educated as to the individual life of Ms. Dauphinais, and be educated as to the law as it relates to the sentencing goals of punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation, both in writing and in the courtroom today. You all did an excellent job with that. I keep calling you Colonel when your name is Durant. Yes, because I know someone else named that, so I apologize for that. I'm just realizing that. I've done it twice, so my apologies. You know your name. I know your name. Just a mistake. I apologize for that. I'd like to start off with Elijah. For the last 3 years, over 3 years now, I've come to know him, and especially in the beginnings of this sentencing, in terms of the notice of intent to plea and all of the filings, I've been educated as to who this little boy was. You've seen it. It was brought up on the screen. This is how people should remember Elijah. I've seen other photos of this. Some of the law enforcement in this room have seen Elijah in completely different circumstances. And I appreciate the trauma that's inflicted when you see that. The attorneys have seen it, for instance. And I certainly have seen it. But that picture of him staring out at us is a picture of innocence. It's a picture, photograph of a defenseless, vulnerable, dependent little guy who is smiling, and you can see the life in him. You can see the love in that little boy's face. It's a photograph of love. It's a photograph of a 5-year-old in the back of a stroller who deserves nothing but love. The one thing he didn't deserve is hate. And hate rained down upon him, unfortunately. As said in the impact statements and described by the various family members, he was a little boy full of love, full of life, charm, a rambunctious little guy with a spirit and the biggest of smiles. He's got one on his face in Exhibit 1. My hope, our hope, I hope it's all of our prayer now, is that Elijah, you're in heavenly places. Now where all your tears are wiped away. Your wounds from your life on this earth are healed. There is no more suffering for Elijah. Just peace and love. He deserves it. My hope and prayer is that he now has it. Because he didn't, especially during the last year of his life. To the law enforcement people who are in this room, quite a few of you, we appreciate all of your investigative work, especially in a tragic case like this, for your dedication and your commitment, not just to justice, but to Elijah. That's really what you were working for. You did everything in your power, with all your talent, with all your experience, to find that little boy. You went from New Hampshire to New York to Massachusetts and other areas, and you found him. The circumstances in which you found him created, I'm sure, just trauma and abject horror. I've seen the photographs. But you and the dogs did your work. And you found this little boy in a shallow grave in Abington, Massachusetts. A place he should have never visited. And the pictures of that little boy in that October are staying with me for the rest of my life. I've done many homicides in my career. I've done 2 specific homicides, one involving Elijah and one involving Brielle, a little 3-year-old girl at the time. Sat through a 2-week trial in Brielle's case. These are the cases that stay with you as a judge the rest of your life. There are things I have seen at that shallow grave and during the autopsy that will impact me and many others who are sitting out in this audience for the rest of our lives. So I really appreciate what the law enforcement officers of this state and other states did to find not only justice in this case, but Elijah. To the family and the community out there, it's pretty clear from these victim impact statements and from the nature of this crime that there's been a ripple effect of impact throughout the family, friends, and our community for this brutal death of a little 5-year-old boy. My thanks to Debbie and Mark, Caleb, Francesca, and Tim for their statements. My hope, though, for that family is that there's a level of healing, not only for them. There needs to be a level of healing now that we're closing this chapter for the community. But there also has to be, even though it's tragic, there has to be in our memories, in all that we look at as we view this type of case, in this specific case, there has to be an unfading memory that will never die of this little boy, of Elijah. He will stay with me, I can guarantee you that. And I hope he stays with the community and with the family. But this photograph, not others that I've seen in this case, is what will really stay with me. That's the Elijah I know. The Elijah in Abington, Massachusetts, he wasn't with us then in spirit. The Elijah in Massachusetts, in that shallow grave, should only be remembered by 2 people. The defendant in this case and Mr. Staff. And those memories should haunt them the rest of their lives. They also should drive them to make sure that that memory is never perpetrated again, whether it be in their lives or other lives they potentially can affect by telling their stories. I don't hold out much hope for that, but you never know. Maybe there'll be a different impact. And then, Ms. Dauphinais, you can remain seated. It was interesting to go through everything very carefully for a number of days and living with this case for 3 years. Because in every case I have, no matter what the crime is, I try to search for some redeeming quality in a person who sits in your position. And I go back to when he arrived. And he comes back in your life. You talked about it. You were searching for him. You wanted him back in your life. And Mr. Lewis dropped him off. I won't get into all the circumstances surrounding that, but I think it was May 26th of 2020 when he came back to you. Here's what you said shortly thereafter on June 13th. And this is where I know there's a redeeming quality in you. There was a yearning to be a parent and help him. Here's the quote. It's far different from some of the other quotes I've heard. I'll get to those. I want to get this little boy help. My heart hurts for him. He just needs help. That's a mother who wants to help, not hate her little boy. And And then we fast forward to September 2021. I'm not going to review all of these statements. You and the members of our community have seen them up on the screen. September 16th of 2021. Piece of shit kid. I won't use the words that precede that. Rotten kid. You indicated in terms of his life that you were the boss. And you went, it's my way now. I'll hang this kid. I hate him. September 21st of 2021, and I have to admit, this is a statement that says it all. We can talk about what happened in the bathroom, and we can have a factual dispute about it, but it really comes down to this. Just whooped the effing maggot's ass. I look at this. This is not a maggot. It's a beautiful little boy. Your words shine a light on your intentions. October 25th, today, we went from, I hate him, I just whipped the maggot's ass, to, I love you, Elijah. All of that has a profound impact on my view of you as an individual. Your words that I've seen are damning in this case. They are cords of terror that rain down on this little boy. They are cords of terror that showed your knowledge, your awareness of the torture you were inflicting upon this little boy. You admit today, and you admitted on September 26th, in very clear words, that you knowingly caused the death of Elijah. And again, I will not get tangled up in the minutiae of what happened, whether it be in the bathroom or other places. The evidence is way beyond a reasonable doubt. It's beyond overwhelming that your hatred imploded into neglect, beatings, starvation, facial and scalp injuries, blunt force trauma, pressure ulcers, hypothermia, confinement and isolation leading to malnourishment and other acute conditions. Acute fentanyl intoxication caused this little boy's death. All those factors combined, and those are coming from the experts, the autopsy. It's an abhorrent, heinous, prolonged terror and torture of a 5-year-old boy, inspired by pure hate. Your words give me a very close view, an inside and up-close personal view of your knowingly intent in this case. You knew exactly what you were doing to Elijah. You were killing him, hour by hour, day by day, month by month. That's the crime I'm looking at. Now my obligation is to weigh the constitutional objectives of punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation in the light of who you, Ms. Dauphinais, are as an individual. There's been talk and there's been pleadings and argument about the comparables in this case. And I've looked through all of them. Obviously, in terms of the State versus Marin case, I lived it for years, tried the case, and sentenced Ms. Marin to 45 years to life. The comparables, while they give me some sense of how other judges have sentenced people in similar circumstances, but not the exact circumstances, because Attorney Faulkner, Attorney Durand, Attorney Hageman, Attorney Hiroshima, you know that sentencing is an individual journey. And I take that very seriously. I have to know the individual who is before me, the crime he or she has committed, and then weigh those constitutional objectives against it. And that's what I'm doing in this case. There is no doubt in my mind also on the other side of things from a mitigation standpoint, based on what I've read about you and heard about you today, that you suffered adult traumatic childhood experiences that impacted your life, both as an individual and as a parent. Adverse childhood experiences. I've read about it in many cases, been trained on it, understand the studies. There is no doubt that you were surviving through that. There's no doubt that it had an impact on your parenting of this little boy. There's no doubt that there was modeling for you that was horrific. There's no doubt that you suffered pain, trauma, abuse in your childhood. And for the most part, especially considering the studies and the research and the publications on that, I consider that a mitigation factor that I've accounted for in my sentence. I've also accounted for what I view as your remorse, your sorrow, and your acceptance of responsibility in this case by entering your plea of guilty. Those, in my view, are all mitigation factors. It is interesting, though, in terms of your adult childhood experiences, from everything I've heard, everything I read, that modeling did not bleed into your life in terms of your daughter since her birth in 2019. So we had very different pictures. We had Elijah in the basement, and then we had you parenting actively your daughter. Not exposed to what Elijah was being exposed to. So it's profoundly interesting, and I gave it a lot of thought of the dichotomy between these two children and how that was impacted by your childhood experiences. So I'm going to view that, though, primarily as mitigation in this particular case for you, and based on what you told me about it personally today and through Attorney Puritan. The aggravating factors I've talked about already. The primary aggravating factors in this case are your intent and your actions that just speak volumes about the terror and the trauma and the torture that this little boy was experiencing at your hands. And I am not in any way absolving Mr. Staff of his role in that. He had hands on this child. He was there a lot of the time. His guilt has been borne and he is serving his sentence. But he's right there with you. He's a partner, ultimately, and he's admitted so in the death of Elijah. The level of your consciousness of guilt is also proven way beyond a reasonable doubt just in the burial circumstances, both your words and your actions. And I'm not going to go through it. You lived it. We've heard a lot about it from the state, justifiably. That is a journey through your words and through your actions that was, to quote Attorney Faulkner in his view of these circumstances, terrible. I think it's beyond terrible, and I agree with him that it's a complete nightmare. The main brunt of this nightmare, and a person who lived a nightmare, beyond all nightmares, for months, was little Elijah, isolated, in a shower, with complaints over Facebook, especially in the last week of his life, that he won't stand up. This 19-pound, tortured little guy couldn't stand up. Just horrific. A brutal reign of torture for months, a slow, prolonged, and painful death of an innocent and blameless 5-year-old boy. A trail of words and actions that scream of the evil that was put upon this isolated, little, defenseless, innocent child. I will tell you that as I view this case, Ms. Dauphinais, I view it as a case where punishment is at the highest level. Both proposals ignore them. Both proposals support that. They evidence it. Your proposal for 35 years to life and the state's proposal of 55 years to life. Incapacitation has to be the primary goal of this sentence. We have to remove you from society and show society, from a judicial standpoint, that justice will be done and the community, especially the children of the community, will be protected. Deterrence, both individual and general, is very clear in this case. I have to send you and the community a very clear message that we will not tolerate a rain upon a little boy that causes his death through hatred, through starvation, through hypothermia, through neglect at levels that are not often seen, if ever. So that message will be sent. In terms of rehabilitation, the case law is very clear. The Constitution is very clear that really the ultimate goal of any sentence is rehabilitation. But it's a minimal goal in this case. It's a goal that you can still accomplish while you're in prison. It's a goal that you can live your life there in a way that is an example to others, disciplinary-free, engaging in programs, furthering your education for the time that you are there. So you can engage in rehabilitation and reform, and I expect and hope that you will. That's everything that has been weighed into the sentences. It's a case, as I said before, that will stay with many in this courtroom, and it's a case that deserves significant, severe, and prolonged incarceration. With that all being said, if you would stand, I'm going to sentence you as follows. These three sentences are all in 226-2021 CR 944. To charge ID number 9196813-1C. Upon your plea of guilty to the crime of second-degree murder, knowingly, you are sentenced as follows. You are sentenced to the New Hampshire State Prison for not more than life nor less than 50 years. There is added to the minimum sentence a disciplinary period equal to 150 days for each year of the minimum term of your sentence to be prorated for any part of the year. You are entitled to pretrial confinement credit of 1,103 days. This sentence is to be served as follows. Stand committed, commencing October 25th, 2024. The sentence is consecutive to 2/26/2021 CR 944-196901C, if that sentence is ever imposed. Other conditions of this sentence are, if required by statute or Department of Corrections policies and procedures, you shall provide a sample for DNA analysis. In terms of restitution, you shall pay restitution capped at $40,000. I trust that that restitution will be paid through the correctional facility or Department of Corrections as directed by the probation parole officer. A 17% administrative fee is assessed for collection of restitution, so I will check that box off. Counsel, is there a need for a hearing on restitution? If so, I'll check the next box off regarding the request to address that.
Excuse me. Your Honor, at this time, we have no claim for restitution to be made, so I don't believe we need a hearing.
Okay.
We'll notify defense counsel if something changes.
Very good. Thank you. So I won't check the other box off. As it relates to your appointed counsel, based on your incarceration, I find that you have no ability to pay counsel fees and expenses. You are to participate meaningfully in and complete any counseling, treatment, and educational programs as directed by the correctional authority or the probation parole officer. In terms of the no contact provision, it's a stand committed sentence, so I will vacate that condition under State versus Toll. That will be taken care of administratively at the prison. Law enforcement agencies may destroy the evidence or return evidence to its rightful owner. The defendant and the state have waived sentence review in writing and on the record at the hearing on September 26, 2024. You are ordered to be of good behavior and comply with all terms of this sentence. Good behavior means that you not commit any federal, state, or local crime. And finally, first of all, you waive your right to seek earned time credit under RSA 651A22A. Secondly, you may not profit in any manner from these offenses, including the murder, life of Elijah Lewis, or flight from the investigation. Specifically, you shall not accept any payment, enter into any contract, or sell any rights regarding any book, film, television show, radio show, website, podcast, or any other writing, recording, broadcast, or internet posting relating to the offenses, the murder, or Elijah Lewis. Do you fully understand that sentence?
Yes, Your Honor.
And then we'll proceed to the two sentences for witness tampering. Those sentences are identical and concurrent with each other and consecutive to the sentence I just read to you if they are ever imposed. So I'll read these to you one time. Again, upon your plea of guilty to witness tampering in charge ID numbers 196901C and 196903C, findings of guilty are entered, and you are sentenced as follows on each of these convictions. You are sentenced to the New Hampshire State Prison for not more than 7 years, no less than 3.5 years. There is added to the minimum sentence a disciplinary period equal to 150 days for each year of the minimum term of your sentence to be prorated for any part of the year. The sentence is to be served as follows. Stand committed, commencing October 25th of 2024. The sentences are consecutive to charge ID number 1968131C. That's the second-degree murder sentence. They are concurrent with each other. Again, if required by statute or Department of Corrections policies and procedures, you shall provide a sample for DNA analysis. And again, as it relates to your appointed counsel fees, the court finds you have no ability to pay counsel fees and expenses, and you are to participate meaningfully in and complete any counseling, treatment, and educational programs as directed by the correctional authority or the probation parole officer. Law enforcement agencies may destroy the evidence or return evidence to its rightful owner. You and the state have waived sentence review in writing and on the record on September 26th of this year. You're ordered to be of good behavior and comply with all terms of this sentence. You waive your right to seek earned time credit, and as I read to you before, there's a condition that you may not profit in any way from these particular offenses, the murder or Elijah Lewis. I won't read those words to you again. You've already heard them directly, but they apply to both the witness tampering sentences as well. Do you understand those two sentences, Ms. Dauphinais?
Yes, Your Honor.
Anything further from the state, Attorney Durand or Attorney Hackman?
No, Your Honor, nothing from the state.
And anything from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. All right, that'll conclude the hearing.
Thank you, Judge.